Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the creative director of RuneQuest and all things BRP at Chaosium. We talked about borrowing creatively. Sometimes there can be a foggy line between whether you are drawing inspiration from something and creating your own exciting take on it, or whether you're being a little bit derivative. Jason talks about how you can borrow in ways that's good for your games and also that is respectful of the content that you draw from. I'll jump across the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
From the earliest days of the industry, there's always been a big hobbyist market because when there were just a few sort of tentpole games out there, there was a lot of empty space. The prevalence of licensed games wasn't quite there, but you had a phenomenal number or a percentage of the gamer population that were readers that were coming in from reading heroic or fantasy fiction or science fiction or whatnot. And so there was this desire to sort of play in the settings of these worlds that they had encountered or to build their own, because I think there's an enormous amount of creativity in the game playing community. People, many GMs are would if they didn't have gaming, they might be writing novels or screenplays or something like that, although that's a little more challenging to make a lucrative living during, but I think, or doing. But I think that there's always been this sort of a desire to tinker, to sort of take things and adapt things. And the earliest phases of, you can't talk about early gaming without talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons from the get-go initially was very much add things, change things, make the rules your own, adapt things as you will, which is kind of interesting that, now it's your Glorantha may vary as pretty much, our rallying cry for RuneQuest. But I think there's always been this desire for hobbyists to tinker with games, to add games. I mean, when I look back at early games, I mean, I was playing Dragon Quest, and then I decided, oh, I really love Michael Moorcock's Hawkmoon novels, and so I was adapting Hawkmoon into a Dragon Quest setting way back in the day. Or when I got Stormbringer, I would immediately start adding new character professions and new monsters, and because the sort of openness of the basic role-playing system made it so easy to you could see how monsters were created. You could see how character classes were built or professions. And so I think that in many ways, BRP was probably one of the biggest ones in that it was so open to a lot of this kit bashing and tinkering and adapting. And yeah, I mean, I was working on my own adaptation of basic role playing to The Dying Earth before I heard, oh, there's a Dying Earth RPG coming out. Well, I guess I'll just put that on the shelf. And I know so many people who have always been, like they take one system and they immediately want to run it with another setting. They say, oh, I met a guy who uses GURPS to play Dungeons and Dragons. I was like, what? I've adapted every single class, every single spell, every single feat into GURPS terms. And I was like, that's, you go. I was, but I think that there's just, there's something about gaming and tabletop RPGs and that invite this level of digging in and cross-pollinizing. You take the setting from one RPG and you maybe don't like the rules, and so you run it with a rule system you like. Or, I think, in some cases, I don't think very many people take a setting they love and run it with rules they don't like, but I guess the opportunity is there. And in some cases, people want more crunch. Sometimes they want much less crunch.
How has this idea of people borrowing and reusing content evolved over the years? What's the best version of it as it appears now, where people are able to do it in all kinds of exciting ways?
I think that the most exciting for me as a designer have been, I mean, it's not necessarily recent, but the appearance of games that are very much open source. Like the to me the most important game that came out in the I'm trying to think, 90s, early 90s was Fudge. The I can't even remember what the F stood for, but it was like the free and universal game anyway, game diced engine, something like that. But that opened up the way to so many different games. You have the entire Fate universe came out of people who were playing Amber Diceless role playing and decided that it needed more rules, and so they actually they used Fudge to create Fate, which is kind of an interesting thing. But I think that a lot of this idea of rules as sort of starting core, like almost I would say like source code, like treating rule systems as source code. I think that that's kind of a new-ish, maybe the last 20 years or so. That's an exciting development because it sort of opens up the world. The whole OGL, the ORC, these sort of open licenses, Creative Commons, so that people can take these game engines and they know that they're reliable, that there's an audience for them, that they don't need to re-engineer dice mechanics from scratch and probabilities and whatnot. And then they can build games and add settings and focus on the creative part of those. I think that that's my most exciting thing.
People fairly often make games that are pretty heavily inspired by movies sometimes, or even other tabletop role-playing games. How do you feel about all of that, and what's good about it, what's maybe not so good?
Okay. The good part is I think that the ability to take things and riff off of them has been a tremendous boost to the indie publishing industry. You get a lot of stuff happening in the ORC or the OSR, which are people basically riffing off Dungeons and Dragons or riffing off iterations of Dungeons and Dragons. It's almost like jazz musicians each doing their own version of different songs, or perhaps a worse example, people uh, what is that joke? The
Aristocrats
anyway,
joke.
the aristocrats. Yeah, I mean, it's in ways some of these are riffs off the aristocrats, but I think that that's kind of cool, and it develops a lot of interesting, what do you say, iterations and thesis, antithesis, new synthesis sorts of games happening. I think that and it also lets people, a lot of, I would say, parts of the marketplace, the gaming community that aren't served by a lot of the larger, more commercial releases are finding that they're able to find and make games that are very much for them and their interests and reflect their view of the world or their experiences. And I think that's really cool. A thing that I don't speak for the large part of the community, but I think that a thing that I personally think is kind of is at times it can become sort of a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Like these games can, it's sort of odd when games, like, to me, take the idea of, say, the fantasy universe from something like Dungeons and Dragons and act as if that's a base reality, and then extrapolate new games and new worlds and new social systems and cultures based on the very sort of arbitrary codified rules of the Dungeons and Dragons original setting, to the point where character classes are sort of these monolithic social concepts that exist, and levels are something that people recognize in the world. That I find is a little awkward, or I don't personally find it that interesting.
A slight sidebar, just quickly. I know you spent a lot of time in Japan. I'm pretty sure that there is a sort of a genre in anime that's kind of like a reflection of that a little bit, but maybe it's more interesting because it's applying a kind of filmic perspective where people sort of fall into games and they rely on that sort of structure to be able to tell a story. Is that something you're familiar with, or?
I would say familiar with, no. Aware of, yes, yes. The interconnectedness of the Japanese manga, anime, and gaming worlds are very, very strong, and they do feed off each other to the point where it becomes almost this odd. There's this whole hybrid or synthesis universe there, and in some cases, games as well, like computer games, have entered that. But you find that there's a whole genre of anime and manga and tabletop games that are very much influenced by computer games. And as a result, the computer games, which began by being influenced by the manga and by the anime, become like additional, like I said, they sort of support and feed off each other and have created this gestalt of this whole. I don't think there's a word for trans genre or trans medium experience, to where like you just have this whole gaming aesthetic that many of these games and anime and manga all have. And in Japan, it's a lot easier for companies to just boom, hit and do all of that. Whereas like cross platform type stuff is much more common. Whereas in America, there are very few like television producers who are also capable of creating an RPG or film studios that can put out a computer game. That is extremely unlikely to happen.
Pulling things back out to a familiar TTRPG, then I'm a big fan of Mothership, the TTRPG, which I believe
Oh
is
yeah,
built on sort of around Alien kind of as an idea, and
right, yes.
taking specifically a story, or like not even necessarily the IP itself, but a theme. It's kind of in between the setting and the rules. What do you think of that?
Well, I think, for example, Mothership is quite interesting because, like you mentioned, it, a little inspired by Alien, but then it's also inspired by a lot of the sort of, I would say, the deep space horror and alienation stuff. There's a little bit of silent running, some what's that? Anyway, some Event Horizon. It's this notion of the horror and the emptiness of space as being primal as this driving force. And I think it's interesting though, because I actually am quite fond of Mothership. And I noticed that the amount of material that comes out for it is hugely variable. I mean, people are doing space cowboy settings. They're doing near straight out dungeon crawls. They're doing weird fantasy stuff. They're doing, here's where it's Mothership, but it's set on Arrakis with the serial numbers filed off, or it's it's a little more Galactic Empire, Star Wars, laser swords and whatnot happening. And I think that's kind of interesting that it starts in this like framework for horror, but goes far beyond that. And that's quite neat. And I think Mothership is a really interesting example of a game in which, the early bare bones release of the game was like the player survival kit. And that was released, if I remember correctly, for free. You could get the PDF for free, and the physical book itself was extremely small. And it's only now like that they're actually have kickstarted a full game master book and the idea of ways to build campaigns with the game, whereas almost everything else was relying on the creative community and the supporters of the game to do third-party publishing. And that's kind of an interesting idea. Give them the tiniest seed of what you need to start an RPG line with, and then letting the community run wild with it.
I'll pull the conversation back in just a moment as we finish up towards some tangible advice for folks. But I want to ask something that you might have a little bit of a unique perspective on, and it's kind of hard to get somebody with this experience. As somebody who's worked extensively with RuneQuest, but also a lot of other lines, sometimes games can literally pull through license agreements and all kinds of things, these copied versions, or copied might be the wrong word here because it gets a bit dicey. We could talk about games like Mithras or Shadow of the Demon Lord, or the Expanse system taking the Fantasy Age bones. Do you have any insights on the complexities of that more professional angle of borrowing engines and settings?
Well, I mean, from a like company, like if we consider a company as an atomic entity, like their idea is if they've got a game system and a line they like, it's far easier for them to say, hey, game X has this large of a following. All of our creative people know how to write for game X. So if we get license, this cool sparkly license, let's say it's about dodos or something like that, and then you can take that and you can add, suddenly everybody just has to shift and focus on the creative content rather than on the rules mechanics, which is great because it gives you a leg up. Now, I think the cross-game hybridization is kind of interesting. I'll speak from with the Conan line that I did that was kind of fun, as we actually had two instances of borrowing from other game lines, one of which was more borrowing IP and the other was borrowing actually we had three instances on the Conan line of borrowing things from other game lines. Well, the first is dealing with Cthulhu in the Conan universe. And that was very clearly because H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were pen pals and considered themselves, as much friends as one can be, in that they had, I don't know that they ever actually met personally. I can't remember. Their entire existence was just fan letters and arguing with each other over over letters. But Robert E. Howard integrated elements of the Cthulhu mythos into many of his stories, which were connected with the Conan history. And Lovecraft considered and used some Howardian inventions and integrated those into the Cthulhu mythos. So you have this setup where two writers have sort of interlocked their creative mythologies, but due to licensing agreements, Modiphius had Conan, Chaosium had Call of Cthulhu. So what we at Modiphius did was we went and we were very careful to borrow bits of the mythos that were the connected bits, but weren't pulling from actual Chaosium creative content. And so that was a very delicate dance. And actually some of that would require me to come. And since I was straddling both worlds there, working at both companies, I had to sort of say, hey, Chaosium friends, is this part of Chaosium creative IP or is this open? And, that way I was able to make sure that all of our Conan content was stuck to stuff that was in the public domain. But there were two other instances for two games. One which we borrowed we asked, I think it was a system for creating cults for the Nameless Cults book, where we actually, a writer had come up with one for his horror game. And we just said flat out, hey, can we borrow that? And he said, absolutely, sure, just give me credit. And so we sort of reskinned it for Conan. And we put a very big thank you and, in the front of the book and all that. And then for a later bit, we were working on an expansion for a game for Funcom, which has some kind of an arrangement with Freya Ligon. And so we borrowed the hex crawling system from Forbidden Lands and put it into a source book for the Conan Exiles source book, which was kind of a weird hybrid of things. It's a tabletop adaptation of an MMO, and we borrowed another game's hex crawl mechanic for it. It was, just kind of a weird synthesis of many things coming together. But part of that also was possible because of Fred Malmberg, who, as a giant in the Swedish gaming industry, computer and tabletop, and owner of the Conan IP, he was able to just say, hey, guys, can we all talk together here? And so it all worked smoothly and with much, much friendship and collaboration there.
So as a final note, just to get everybody thinking, if you have people out there who, and this is the funnest part of TTRPGs, have read all kinds of awesome and exciting stuff and they want to show to their friends, they want to talk about these things, how do you borrow in the best way? How do you incorporate everything in a way that makes it positive, but is also exciting? Do you have any tips or tricks?
I will note that the hardcover of Basic Role Playing just went on sale a few days ago and is now available in stores near you or via mail order, ideally through Chaosium. But the core goal of the Basic Role Playing system, the book I wrote, was very much to take to take ideas for games or to take existing settings, whether they be historical or something you saw in a movie or something you read in a comic or a book, and to turn those into your own games. And so, I mean, the book itself basically walks you through step by step of like, these are the optional rules you need to get to simulate these things. And it tries to be as transparent as possible so that you as a game master, you could even sit around with your players and decide what rules you like and don't like and what optional rules you want to add to your games. And that's I think something that is kind of unique in the gaming space. I don't know of very many games where actually building the rules of your game and the physical systems that you will interact with throughout the gameplay can be a collaborative player invested activity. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything more exciting than, sitting around as a game master and the players and saying, hey, let's just a la carte, custom build the game we want to play. And more than just here's, you can add some stuff to the content, but I'm going to handle all the rules, to be able to say, no, let's all figure out what sort of shared rules we're going to use for our shared experience.